Welcome. You have found your way here at the end of the day. Take a moment now. Let your breathing settle. Let the noise of the hours behind you begin to fade. Tonight, we are going somewhere cold. Not the cold of a winter morning or a brisk walk, but the kind of cold that defines survival. We are travelling to the forests of Scandinavia centuries ago, when winter temperatures fell to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and sometimes lower still. In that world, warmth was not a switch on the wall. It was something built, tended and protected through the long Arctic night. Families slept in wooden cabins surrounded by frozen darkness. They woke again in the morning. This is the story of how that was possible. It is not dramatic. It is careful, methodical and quiet. It is the story of wood and moss, fire and wool, and the small rituals that kept people alive. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit is not just cold, it is a threshold. At that temperature, exposed skin begins to freeze in minutes. Moisture in the air crystallizes instantly. Metal becomes painful to touch. The cold does not simply make you uncomfortable. It begins to shut your body down, drawing heat away faster than your metabolism can replace it. For the people of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, this was not an extreme event. It was winter. In the northern latitudes, temperatures regularly dropped to -30 during the darkest months. Occasionally they went lower. The land froze solid. Rivers turned to ice thick enough to support sledges. The air itself seemed to sharpen. In this environment, survival depended on one thing: keeping the interior of your home warm enough that sleep was possible. Not comfortable necessarily, but survivable. The margin for error was small. If the fire went out, if a draft found its way through a gap in the wall, if moisture condensed and soaked through your bedding, the cold would begin to win. There was no calling for help. There were no emergency services. If your shelter failed, you faced the night with nothing between you and the frozen air but your own body heat. And that was not enough. The people who lived in these regions understood this completely. They did not think of cold as an inconvenience. They thought of it as a constant pressure, something that surrounded the home and waited. Their response was not to fight the cold, but to build around it, layer by layer, until the interior space became something the cold could not reach. This was not done with modern materials. There was no fiberglass insulation, no central heating, no thermostats. The materials available were wood, moss, stone, wool, and fire. The knowledge available was what had been passed down through generations, refined each winter, tested each night. The cabins themselves were small. They had to be. A large space requires more heat to maintain, and heat was a limited resource. Families lived in single rooms, sometimes with livestock sharing the same roof. The ceilings were low, the windows were tiny or non-existent. Every design choice was made with thermal efficiency in mind, even if the people making those choices did not use those words. What they knew was this: if you built the cabin correctly, if you banked the fire properly, if you layered your bedding and sealed the drafts, you could sleep through the night at -30 and wake in the morning. The cold would still be there, waiting outside, but you would be alive. That knowledge, how to build, how to prepare, how to sleep, was the difference between survival and failure. It was not written down in manuals. It was learned by watching, by doing, by enduring winter after winter in the same small wooden room. And it worked. For thousands of years it worked. The foundation of the Scandinavian log cabin was not just any wood. It was wood that grew in a specific way, shaped by the very cold it would later be used to resist. In the high latitudes of Scandinavia, the growing season is short. Trees have only a few months each year to add new growth. The rest of the time, they are dormant, locked in winter. This cycle produces something unusual: timber with exceptionally narrow growth rings. The species most commonly used were Scots pine and Norway spruce. Both are conifers, evergreens adapted to cold climates. When a tree grows slowly, adding only a thin layer of new wood each year, the result is dense timber. The cells are packed tightly together. The wood is heavy, strong, and remarkably stable. This density matters because wood is not a solid material. It is porous, filled with microscopic air pockets trapped within the cellular structure. These pockets act as insulation. Air is one of the best insulators available, as long as it is not moving. The wood holds it in place, preventing convective heat loss. At the same time, the solid portions of the wood, the cellulose and lignin that form the cell walls, provide thermal mass. This is the wood's ability to absorb heat and release it slowly over time. During the day, when the fire is burning, the log walls absorb warmth. At night, as the room cools, the walls release that stored heat back into the space. The process is gradual. A thick log wall does not heat up quickly, and it does not cool down quickly either. It acts as a buffer, smoothing out the temperature fluctuations that would otherwise occur in a small wooden room heated by a single fire. The builders of these cabins preferred heartwood over sapwood. Heartwood is the older inner core of the tree. It contains natural resins that make it resistant to decay and insect damage. These resins also increase the wood's density slightly, improving its thermal properties. Sapwood, the outer layer of the tree, is less durable and more prone to rot. It was used when necessary, but was not the first choice. The logs themselves were thick. A typical cabin wall was built from logs that measured 8 to 10 inches in diameter, sometimes more. When stacked horizontally, these logs created a continuous barrier between the inside and outside. There were no studs, no gaps, no places where heat could escape through a structural weak point. Every inch of the wall provided both strength and insulation. This is different from modern construction, where walls are built as frames with insulation packed between vertical studs. In that system, the wooden studs themselves become thermal bridges, paths where heat can escape more easily than through the insulation. A log wall has no such bridges. It is monolithic, a single unbroken mass of wood from top to bottom. The thermal resistance of a material is measured in R value. The higher the R value, the better the insulation. A solid log wall 8 to 10 inches thick provides an R value of approximately 9 to 12. That number may not sound impressive compared to modern insulated walls, but it is achieved without any additional materials. The log itself is the insulation. And the wood does something else, it breathes. Wood is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs and releases moisture from the air. In a sealed cabin, where cooking and breathing and even the presence of livestock create humidity, this property is essential. The logs absorb excess moisture when the air is damp and release it when the air is dry. This prevents condensation from forming on cold surfaces, which would lead to rot and mould. The people who built these cabins did not understand the physics in modern terms. They did not calculate R values or discuss thermal mass, but they understood the material. They knew which trees grew in the right conditions, which logs would split cleanly, which wood would resist rot. They knew that thick logs from slow-growth forests worked better than thin logs from fast-growth forests. They knew this because they had tried both, and one kept them warmer. The wood, in a sense, remembered the cold that shaped it. And in the cabin, it used that memory to resist the cold once more. A stack of logs is not a cabin. Without a method to lock the logs together, the structure would simply collapse or shift apart under its own weight. The people of Scandinavia developed a solution that was both simple and precise, the interlocking corner joint. This technique, known as Nuttimring in Sweden and Lafteverk in Norway, emerged in its refined form around the 11th or 12th century. It allowed logs to overlap at the corners, creating a frame that was self-supporting and resistant to wind pressure. More importantly, it created a structure that became tighter over time. The principle is straightforward. At each corner of the cabin, the logs are notched so that they fit together like puzzle pieces. Each log rests in a carved notch on the log below it, and the log above it rests in a notch carved into the first. The result is a series of alternating overlaps that lock the entire wall into place. The skill was in the cutting. The notches had to be precise. If they were too shallow, the logs would not sit firmly. If they were too deep, the structural integrity of the log would be compromised. The angle and depth of each notch had to match the contour of the log it would rest against, and because logs are not perfectly round, each notch was slightly different. Builders used a tool called a drag jern, or scriber. This was a pair of metal arms connected at a pivot point, similar to a compass. One arm traced the surface of the lower log, while the other marked a corresponding line on the log that would sit above it. The result was a perfect copy of the lower log's irregular shape. transferred to the upper log. Once the line was scribed, the builder carved out the notch using a broad axe or adze. The cut had to be smooth and accurate. Any gap or unevenness would allow air to pass through, and even a small draft could make the difference between a warm cabin and a cold one. The genius of the interlocking joint was not just in its initial fit, it was in how the structure responded to time. Wood is not a stable material. It shrinks as it dries, and in the dry cold of a Scandinavian winter, green logs could lose a significant amount of their moisture content over the first few years. In a vertical construction, where posts stand upright and planks are nailed between them, this shrinkage creates gaps. The planks pull away from the posts, leaving cracks where wind can enter. But in a horizontal log construction, the shrinkage works differently. The logs shrink primarily in their width and thickness, not in their length. As they dry, the entire wall settles downward. The weight of the structure ensures that this settling does not create gaps. The logs above press down on the logs below, and the pressure increases as more logs are added. When the roof is built, often a heavy turf roof that could weigh several tons, the weight becomes immense. The logs are compressed together, and the joints are held tight by sheer gravitational force. Over time, as the logs continue to dry and settle, the structure actually becomes more airtight. The notches fit more snugly. The overlapping corners press tighter. What started as a well-built cabin becomes a sealed envelope, with the wood itself adapting to create a better seal. To prevent the logs from twisting as they dried, builders used hidden wooden pegs called dimlingar. These were driven vertically through holes bored through 2 or 3 layers of logs at regular intervals along the wall. The pegs locked the logs in alignment, preventing them from rotating or bowing outward. The choice of wood for the pegs was deliberate. Builders used wood that was slightly drier than the wall logs. As the wall logs dried and shrank, the pegs would absorb moisture from the surrounding wood and swell slightly. This created a permanent lock, holding the logs in a rigid, stable alignment even as the structure continued to settle. The result was a building that improved with age. The first winter in a new cabin was often the coldest, because the logs had not yet fully settled. By the second or third winter, after the wood had seasoned and the weight of the roof had compressed the joints, the cabin reached its full thermal efficiency. This was architecture that worked with the material rather than against it. The builders did not try to prevent the wood from moving. They anticipated the movement and designed the structure to benefit from it. The interlocking joint was not just a method of assembly, it was a method of adaptation. The dragyern, the scriber, was a simple tool. 2 metal arms, hinged at one end with sharp points at the other. It looked unremarkable. But in the hands of a skilled builder, it was the tool that made the difference between a cabin that held heat and one that did not. The process began after a log was selected and positioned. The log would be placed roughly where it would eventually sit on the wall, resting on top of the log below it. The 2 logs would touch at several points, but they would not fit together. Logs are not uniform. They taper, they curve, they have knots and irregularities. To create a tight seal, the upper log had to be carved to match the exact shape of the lower one. This is where the scriber was used. The builder adjusted the arms of the scriber to a fixed width, typically matching the diameter of the log. Then, with one arm resting on the surface of the lower log, the builder traced the length of the log from end to end. As the lower arm followed the contours, rising over bumps, dipping into hollows, the upper arm marked a corresponding line on the underside of the upper log. The result was a line that, when carved away, would create a surface that fit perfectly against the lower log. The process was repeated for the entire length of the log, and then again for the corner notches, where the log would overlap with the perpendicular wall. Carving the groove required precision. The tool used was typically a broad axe or a specialised adze with a curved blade. The builder worked along the scribed line, removing wood in controlled strokes. The goal was to create a smooth, continuous channel that matched the shape of the log below. This channel was called the long drag, or long groove. It ran the entire length of the log, and when the log was finally lowered into place, the edges of the groove would rest on the shoulders of the log beneath. The weight of the log pressed these contact points together, creating a seal. But the seal was not complete yet. Even with perfect carving, there would be microscopic gaps, irregularities too small to see but large enough to let air pass through. To address this, builders placed a layer of material in the groove before lowering the upper log. The material most commonly used was moss, specifically a species called stair-step moss, which grew in the forests and was harvested in the autumn. The moss was fibrous, elastic, and naturally resilient. When compressed, it formed a dense, felt-like layer that filled every tiny gap between the logs. The moss was laid into the carved groove in long strips, packed loosely at first. Then the upper log was lowered into place. The weight of the log compressed the moss, squeezing it into a thin gasket that sealed the joint. Over time, as the log settled and dried, the moss would compress further, but it would not crack or pull away. It remained flexible, expanding and contracting with the wood as the cabin breathed. The precision of this process cannot be overstated. A single, poorly scribed log could create a draft that would compromise the warmth of the entire cabin. A groove carved too shallow would leave gaps. A groove carved too deep would weaken the log. The scriber had to be set correctly. The line had to be followed exactly, and the carving had to be smooth and consistent. This was not fast work. Single log could take hours to scribe and carve properly. A cabin of even modest size required dozens of logs, and each one had to be fitted individually. There were no shortcuts. The builder worked methodically, checking the fit, adjusting the groove, testing the seal before moving on to the next log. The skill required years to develop. A novice could learn to use the scriber, but understanding how much wood to remove, how to read the grain, how to anticipate the way the log would settle, that came only with experience. Master builders were valued not because they worked faster, but because they worked more accurately. Their cabins were warmer, their joints were tighter, and their structures lasted longer. The dragyon itself was often a personal tool, passed down through generations or crafted to the specific preferences of the builder. The weight of the arms, the sharpness of the points, the tension of the hinge, all of these affected how the tool felt in the hand and how accurately it could trace a line. In the end, the scriber was more than a tool. It was the means by which the builder transferred their knowledge into the structure. Every line traced, every groove carved, was an act of understanding. Understanding the wood, the weather, the cold, and the needs of the family who would live inside. The precision of the scriber was the precision of survival. Even with the most careful scribing and the most precise carving, the joint between two logs was not perfect. Wood is organic. Its surface is irregular, marked by subtle curves, grain patterns, and microscopic roughness. When two logs were pressed together, they touched at some points and left tiny gaps at others. These gaps were small, often invisible to the eye, but they were enough. Air could pass through them, and in a cabin at 30 degrees below zero, even the smallest draft could carry away significant heat. The solution was not to try to make the logs perfectly smooth. That would have been impractical and would have weakened the wood. Instead, the builders placed a flexible material between the logs, something that could fill the gaps and adapt to the wood's movement. The material they chose was moss, specifically a species known as stair-step moss, or Hylocomium splendens. This moss grew abundantly in the forests of Scandinavia, forming thick, springy carpets on the forest floor. It was harvested in late summer or early autumn, when it was dry but still pliable. The moss was gathered in large bundles and stored until it was needed for construction. The properties of this moss made it ideal for chinking. It was fibrous, with long interwoven strands that gave it structure. When compressed, it did not crumble or break apart. Instead, it compacted into a dense, resilient mat. And when the pressure was released, it expanded again, though not quite to its original volume. This elasticity was critical. As the logs dried and settled over the first few years of the cabin's life, they would shift slightly. A rigid sealant, such as clay or lime mortar, would crack under this movement, pulling away from the wood and leaving gaps. But moss moved with the wood. It compressed when the logs pressed together and expanded when they pulled apart, maintaining the seal. The moss also had natural preservative properties. It contained phenolic compounds that inhibited the growth of fungi and bacteria. in the dark, potentially damp environment of the log joint. This was important. Wood that stayed wet would rot. The moss helped keep the joint dry by wicking moisture away from the wood surface and allowing it to evaporate into the surrounding air. The process of placing the moss was straightforward but required care. After the long drag, the long groove, was carved into the underside of a log, the builder would lay strips of moss along the length of the groove. The moss was not packed tightly at this stage, it was laid loosely in a layer thick enough to ensure full coverage but not so thick that it would prevent the log from sitting properly. Then the log was lifted and lowered into place. As it descended, the weight of the log pressed the moss into the groove, compressing it into a thin gasket. The builder would check the fit, sometimes lifting the log again to adjust the moss if the seal was not uniform. Once the log was in position, the moss was effectively locked in place. The weight of the logs above, combined with the eventual weight of the roof, ensured that the moss remained compressed. Over time it would settle further, becoming a permanent flexible barrier between the logs. In some cabins, particularly in poorer households, or in regions where moss was less abundant, other materials were used for chinking. Wool was common, either raw fleece or old, worn-out clothing that had been shredded into fibres. Straw was used occasionally, though it was less effective because it compacted too much and did not recover its volume. In extreme cases, families would use whatever was available: scraps of fabric, animal hair, even old bedding. But moss remained the preferred material. It was free, abundant, and superior in performance. A cabin chinked with moss could remain sealed for decades, requiring only minor maintenance to replace sections that had deteriorated or been disturbed by pests. There was also a practical rhythm to the use of moss. In the autumn, after the harvest, families would gather moss from the forest and dry it for the winter ahead. If a cabin needed repairs, if a log had shifted or a gap had opened, the moss could be replaced during the short summer months, when the weather allowed for outdoor work. The moss itself became part of the cabin's life cycle. It aged with the structure, darkening and compacting over the years. In very old cabins, the moss in the lower logs could be 50 or 60 years old, still doing its job, still sealing the gaps. This was not a sophisticated material by modern standards. It was not engineered or manufactured. It was simply gathered from the forest and put to use. But it worked because it matched the properties of the wood it was sealing. Both were organic, both responded to moisture and temperature, both moved and settled over time. The moss was a living gasket in the sense that it adapted. It was not inert. It responded to the environment, adjusting its volume and flexibility as conditions changed. And in doing so, it kept the cold outside and the warmth inside. In the end, the moss was as essential to the cabin's survival as the logs themselves. Without it, the precision of the scriber and the skill of the builder would have been wasted. The gaps would have remained, and the cold would have found its way in. With it, the cabin became a sealed envelope, a space where warmth could be held and sleep could happen, even when the world outside was frozen solid. The roof of a Scandinavian log cabin was not a light structure. It was not made of wooden shingles or thin planks. It was made of earth. The traditional roof consisted of multiple layers. First, a framework of wooden beams was laid across the top of the walls, forming a support structure. On top of these beams, birch bark was placed as a waterproof membrane. The bark was harvested in large sheets, overlapped like tiles, and secured with wooden pegs or strips of willow. Over the birch bark, a thick layer of turf was laid. This was not loose soil. It was sod, intact sections of earth with the grass and roots still attached. The roots held the soil together, creating a mat that could be cut into blocks and stacked like bricks. The turf layer was typically 8 to 12 inches thick. Sometimes it was thicker. When dry, this roof weighed several £100 per square metre. When wet from rain or melting snow, it could weigh twice that. And in winter, when snow accumulated on top, the weight increased further. A modest cabin with a turf roof could be supporting 2 to 3 tons of material pressing down on the log walls. A larger structure could bear 5 tons or more. This enormous weight was not a problem, it was intentional. The pressure from the roof served a critical function in the cabin's thermal performance. As the logs settled and dried, they shrank. The walls would sink lower, sometimes by several inches over the first few years. Without constant downward pressure, this settling could create gaps between the logs. especially at the corner joints where the interlocking notches met. But the weight of the roof prevented this. It pressed the logs together continuously, forcing the joints to remain tight even as the wood moved. As the logs shrank, the roof descended with them, maintaining the compression. The heavier the roof, the tighter the seal. This was especially important during the winter. The cold caused the wood to contract slightly, and the dry indoor air, kept dry by the heating, drew moisture out of the logs. Both effects would normally create small gaps, but the weight of the snow-covered roof countered this, pressing the logs together with even greater force. The snow itself added insulation. A thick layer of snow is mostly air-trapped between ice crystals. Air, when still, is an excellent insulator. A roof covered with 2 feet of snow had an additional layer of insulation that reduced heat loss through the ceiling. The cabin became warmer, not colder, as the snow accumulated. The turf layer also provided thermal mass. During the day, when the fire was burning and the interior was warm, the earth in the roof absorbed heat. At night, as the fire was banked and the room cooled, the roof released some of that heat back into the cabin. The effect was subtle, but it helped smooth out the temperature fluctuations. There was a maintenance cost to this design. Turf roofs required care. In the spring, when the snow melted and the rains came, the sod would sometimes wash away or develop bare patches. Grass had to be encouraged to grow, because the roots were what held the structure together. In some regions, families would let goats or sheep graze on the roof during the summer, which kept the grass trimmed and fertilized the soil. But these were minor concerns compared to the benefit. The weight of the roof was what made the cabin functional. It was the constant, patient force that held the entire structure together, year after year, winter after winter. In some areas, particularly in Norway, the turf roof became a symbol of permanence. A cabin with a well-maintained turf roof could last for generations. The roof aged with the structure, the grass turning brown in winter and green in summer, the soil compacting and hardening over time. Eventually the roof became almost like stone, dense, solid, and nearly impermeable. The builders understood this relationship between weight and seal. Even if they did not describe it in those terms, they knew that a heavy roof made a warm cabin. They knew that adding more layers of turf improved the seal. They knew that the snow, rather than being a burden, was an ally. And so they built roofs that were deliberately heavy, roofs that pressed down on the walls with the weight of the earth itself. The cold could not lift that weight. It could not shift the logs or open the joints. The roof held everything in place, and the cabin remained sealed. In the deep winter, when the temperature outside fell to 30 below, and the wind howled across the frozen landscape, the cabin sat beneath its roof of earth and snow, silent and still. The weight above was the weight of survival, pressing down, holding tight, keeping the warmth inside. Fire was the heart of the cabin. Without it, there was no warmth, no cooked food, no light. But fire by itself was not enough. How the fire was managed, how its heat was captured and stored, determined whether the cabin remained warm through the night. The earliest Scandinavian homes used a system called the røykstue, or smoke room. In this design, there was no chimney. The fire burned in an open hearth in the centre of the room, and the smoke rose to the ceiling, where it collected in a thick, hot layer. A hole in the roof, called a lure, allowed some of the smoke to escape, but not all of it. The smoke-filled upper portion of the room was unpleasant to breathe, but it served a purpose. The hot smoke radiated heat downward, warming the space below. The layer of smoke also acted as insulation, trapping heat near the ceiling and preventing it from escaping through the roof. At the same time, the smoke had a preservative effect. It dried the wooden beams and thatch, preventing rot. It killed insects and pests that might otherwise infest the roof. And it gave the interior of the cabin a distinctive smell, sharp, acrid, but familiar. The cost of the røykstue was health. Living in a smoke-filled room caused respiratory problems, eyes watered, throats burned, and over time the constant exposure to particulate matter took a toll. But in the absence of an alternative, it was accepted as part of life. The transition to a proper chimney took centuries. Early chimneys were simple, just a hole in the wall or roof with a stone hood to direct the smoke outside. These improved air quality but were inefficient. Much of the heat went straight up the chimney, and the room remained cold unless the fire was kept burning constantly. The breakthrough came with the masonry stove, which began to appear in Scandinavia during the 18th century. This was not a fireplace with a chimney. It was a large enclosed structure built from stone or brick, designed to capture the heat from a fire and release it slowly over many hours. The stove was massive. A typical masonry stove weighed between 2 and 5 tons. It occupied a significant portion of the cabin, often built into a central wall so that it could radiate heat into multiple rooms. The exterior surface was usually tiled or plastered, smooth and clean, suitable for a living space. Inside, the stove was a labyrinth. The firebox, where the wood was burned, was relatively small, but the flue system was extensive. Instead of allowing the hot gases from the fire to escape directly, the stove channeled them through a series of internal passages that wound back and forth, up and down, sometimes extending 10 meters or more in total length. As the hot gases travelled through these channels, they transferred their heat to the surrounding stone or brick. The masonry absorbed the energy, heating up gradually. By the time the smoke reached the chimney and exited the building, it was barely warm. Almost all of the heat had been extracted and stored in the mass of the stove. This stored heat was then released as radiant energy. Unlike convective heat, which warms the air, radiant heat travels as infrared radiation, warming objects and people directly. A person sitting near a masonry stove would feel the warmth on their skin, even if the air temperature in the room was cool. The efficiency of this system was extraordinary. A single firing, one load of wood burned hot and fast, could keep the stove warm for 12 to 24 hours. In the coldest months, the stove was fired twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. The rest of the time, it simply radiated the stored heat. This changed the nature of fire management. With an open hearth or a metal wood stove, the fire had to be kept burning continuously to maintain warmth. If the fire went out, the room cooled rapidly, but with a masonry stove, the fire was allowed to burn out completely. The stove retained the heat long after the flames were gone. The construction of a masonry stove required specialised knowledge. The design of the flue channels was critical. If the passages were too narrow, they would restrict airflow, and the fire would not burn properly. If they were too wide, the gases would pass through too quickly and not transfer enough heat. The builder had to balance draft, heat transfer, and structural integrity. The materials also mattered. Stone was preferred over brick in some regions because it had higher thermal mass. Soapstone in particular was valued for its ability to absorb and hold heat. A soapstone stove would remain warm to the touch for an entire day after the fire had burned out. The transition from the Roik stew to the masonry stove represented a fundamental shift in how people related to fire. In the smoke room, fire was a constant presence, always burning, always demanding attention. In the masonry stove, fire became a ritual, something that was built, tended, and then allowed to rest while the stone did the work of warming the home. For families living at 30 degrees below zero, this made the difference between exhaustion and rest. They no longer had to wake throughout the night to feed the fire. They could bank the coals in the evening, close the stove, and trust that the heat stored in the stone would carry them through until morning. The masonry stove was not just a heating device, it was a battery, storing energy when it was abundant and releasing it when it was needed. And in the cold darkness of the Scandinavian winter, that stored energy was life. The power of the masonry stove lay hidden inside its walls. From the outside, it appeared as a simple structure, a tall rectangular block of stone or brick with a small door at the base and a flue pipe rising from the top. But inside, the stove was complex, a carefully engineered system designed to extract every possible unit of heat from the burning wood. The process began in the firebox. This was a chamber built from firebrick, a material that could withstand extreme temperatures without cracking. The firebox was not large, typically about the size of a small crate, because the goal was not to burn a large amount of wood slowly, but to burn a moderate amount of wood very hot and very fast. When the fire was lit, the flames reached temperatures of 1200 to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, the wood burned almost completely, leaving little ash and producing minimal creosote. The heat was intense, filling the firebox and radiating into the surrounding walls. But the hot gases from the fire did not go straight up the chimney. Instead, they were directed into the first chamber of the flue system. This chamber was positioned directly above or behind the firebox, and it allowed the gases to expand and slow down. As they slowed, they began to transfer heat to the masonry walls. From the first chamber, the gases were channeled downward into a second passage, then upward again into a third, then downward once more. The exact configuration varied depending on the design, but the principle was consistent. The gases were forced to take the longest possible path before they reached the chimney. Each turn in the flue system created an opportunity for heat transfer. The hot gases came into contact with cool stone and energy moved from the gas to the stone. The stone heated up, the gas cooled down. By the time the gases completed their journey through the labyrinth and entered the chimney, they had lost most of their energy. This was measured by the temperature of the exhaust. In a simple fireplace with a straight chimney, the exhaust gases might exit at 600 or 700 degrees. In a well-designed masonry stove, the exhaust temperature was often below 200 degrees. The difference represented energy that had been captured and stored in the stove rather than lost to the outside air. The walls of the flue chambers were thick, often 6 to 8 inches of solid masonry. This thickness was necessary to provide sufficient thermal mass. The more mass, the more heat could be stored. A stove with thin walls would heat up quickly but cool down quickly as well. A stove with thick walls took longer to heat but retained that heat for many hours. The surface area inside the flue system was also important. The more surface area the hot gases came into contact with, the more heat could be transferred. This is why the flue passages were often narrow and winding rather than wide and straight. The gases were forced to flow along the walls, maximising contact and maximising heat transfer. There was a balance to be maintained. If the flue system was too restrictive, it would create excessive back pressure, and the fire would not draw properly. Smoke would spill out into the room instead of being pulled up through the system. The builder had to ensure that there was enough draft to keep the fire burning cleanly, while still extracting as much heat as possible. This required an understanding of airflow and combustion that was gained through experience. A master stove builder could look at the dimensions of a room, the height of the ceiling, and the layout of the cabin, and design a flue system that would work efficiently in that specific space. The same design would not work everywhere. Each stove was custom built for the home it served. Some stoves included additional features to enhance performance. Baffles, flat plates positioned inside the flue chambers, forced the gases to change direction more sharply, increasing turbulence and improving heat transfer. Clean-out doors allowed access to the flue passages for maintenance, so that any accumulated soot or ash could be removed. The exterior of the stove was also carefully considered. The surface was often tiled or covered with smooth plaster, which made it easy to clean and safe to touch. The tiles themselves contributed to the thermal mass, and they radiated heat evenly across their surface. In some designs, the stove included a bench or shelf built into its structure. Families would sit on these benches during the coldest days, absorbing the radiant heat directly into their bodies. Children would do their tasks near the stove, and in the evening, the warmth from the bench made it a favoured spot for rest. The flue system was not visible. It was buried inside the walls of the stove, hidden from view, but its presence was felt. The stove would remain warm for hours after the fire had gone out, sometimes still radiating gentle heat the following morning. This was the labyrinth at work, holding the energy captured from the flames and releasing it slowly, steadily through the long night. For a family living at 30 degrees below zero, this was what made sleep possible. The stove did not require constant attention. It did not demand that someone wake every few hours to add wood. It simply held the heat, patient and reliable, while the family rested. The labyrinth inside the stove was a kind of memory. It remembered the fire, held its warmth, and gave it back when it was needed most. As the daylight faded and the temperature outside began to drop, the work of preparing for the night began. This was not a hurried process. It was methodical, a series of small actions that, taken together, ensured the cabin would remain warm through the hours of darkness. The fire had been burning steadily throughout the day, fed with logs as needed to maintain a comfortable temperature. But as evening approached, the goal shifted. The fire was no longer meant to provide immediate heat. It was meant to last. The first step was to let the fire burn down. No new wood was added. The flames were allowed to consume the remaining logs until only coals remained. A thick bed of glowing embers, red and orange, radiating intense heat but no longer producing flames. These coals were the foundation of the night's warmth. A properly maintained coal bed could hold heat for many hours, far longer than burning wood. The coals glowed because they were still undergoing combustion, but the process was slow, limited by the amount of oxygen available. Once the coal bed was established, the next step was to arrange it. Using a long iron rake or poker, the person tending the fire would pull the coals into a concentrated pile, usually toward the back of the hearth or the centre of the stove. This reduced the surface area exposed to the air, which slowed the rate of combustion even further. If additional wood was to be added, it was done now, but carefully. The logs chosen for overnight burning were large, dense and unsplit. Hardwoods like oak or birch were preferred because they burned more slowly than softwoods. A single massive log, placed on top of the coal bed, could smoulder for 8 to 10 hours without producing much flame. The logs were positioned in a specific way. They were laid parallel to each other, packed tightly so that there were minimal gaps between them. This configuration, sometimes called east-west loading, restricted airflow. The fire could only spread slowly from one log to the next, and the heat was released gradually rather than all at once. After the logs were in place, the coal bed was covered with ash. This was the most critical step. Ash is an excellent insulator. A layer of fine ash, 2 to 3 inches thick, could be shoveled over the coals, burying them completely. The ash restricted the flow of oxygen to the embers, slowing combustion to an almost imperceptible rate. Beneath the ash, the coals remained alive. They continued to glow, but the heat was trapped. The ash layer acted as a blanket, holding the warmth in and preventing it from radiating into the room too quickly. In the morning, when the ash was raked away, the coals would still be red hot, ready to ignite fresh kindling. This technique required judgment. If the ash layer was too thick, it could smother the coals entirely, extinguishing them. If it was too thin, the coals would burn too quickly and be gone by morning. The person tending the fire had to know the exact thickness that would preserve the ember without killing it. In cabins with masonry stoves, there was an additional step. After the fire was banked, the damper, a metal plate inside the flue, was closed or adjusted to a narrow opening. This restricted the flow of air through the stove, preventing warm air from being pulled up the chimney. The stove retained more of its heat, and the room stayed warmer. The damper had to be adjusted carefully. If it was closed too much, smoke could back up into the room. If it was left too open, heat would escape. The right setting was learned through experience, and it varied depending on the weather, the type of wood being burned, and the condition of the fire. Once the fire was banked and the stove was set, the cabin was sealed for the night. Gaps around doors and windows were checked. In the coldest weather, additional insulation, old blankets, stuffed sacks, even packed snow, was placed against the door to block drafts. The goal was to create a sealed envelope where the warmth could be held. This evening ritual was not optional, it was essential. A poorly banked fire would go out during the night, and the cabin would grow cold. Waking to a cold cabin meant starting the fire from scratch, which required time and effort. Worse, it meant that the night had been colder than it should have been, and the family's sleep had been disrupted. But a properly banked fire was reliable. The coals would last through the night, and in the morning the fire could be revived in minutes. A few shavings of dry bark, a handful of kindling, and a gentle breath of air on the uncovered coals would bring the flames back. There was a particular satisfaction in this. The fire did not die. It was not abandoned. It was simply put to rest, held in suspension, waiting to return. And in the morning, when the ash was pulled back and the ember glowed bright again, it was as if the fire had never left. This continuity was important. In many households, the fire was considered immortal. It was never allowed to go out completely. If it did, it was seen as a failure, a break in the chain of warmth that connected one day to the next, one generation to the next. The evening banking ritual was how that continuity was maintained. It was a small ceremony, performed quietly in the fading light, a promise that the fire would still be there when morning came. Even in a well-built cabin with a properly banked fire, the temperature could drop significantly during the night. The fire's heat, stored in the masonry stove or the log walls, would sustain the main room for hours, but it was not infinite. Toward the coldest part of the night, usually just before dawn, the temperature near the outer walls could approach freezing. For sleep to be safe and restful, an additional layer of protection was needed. This was provided by the box bed. The box bed was a wooden enclosure built into the wall of the cabin, or constructed as a freestanding piece of furniture. It resembled a large cupboard, with a platform inside for sleeping and walls on 3 or 4 sides. Some box beds had solid, wooden doors that could be closed. Others used heavy wool curtains to seal the opening. The dimensions of a box bed were compact. The interior space was typically just large enough for 2 adults or several children to lie down. The length was often surprisingly short, only about 5.5 feet, because people did not sleep lying flat. They slept in a semi-reclined position, propped up by pillows or bolsters, with their knees slightly bent. This sleeping position was common throughout much of Europe during this period. It was partly a matter of space. Shorter beds took up less room, but there was also a cultural belief that lying completely flat was unhealthy, or that it resembled the position of a corpse. Sleeping half upright was thought to aid digestion and breathing. The true function of the box bed was thermal. By enclosing the sleepers in a small volume, the bed created a microclimate that could be warmed by body heat alone. A resting human body generates approximately 100 watts of heat through metabolic processes. This heat is released through the skin and through respiration. In an open room, this heat dissipates quickly, mixing with the cooler air and providing little benefit. But in an enclosed space of only 2 or 3 cubic meters, the effect is significant. 2 people sleeping in a box bed would produce 200 watts of heat continuously throughout the night. This was enough to raise the temperature inside the bed by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, above the temperature of the surrounding room. If the room was at 40 degrees, the interior of the bed could reach 55 degrees, cold by modern standards, but survivable with proper bedding. The enclosure also eliminated drafts. Even in a well-sealed cabin, there was always some air movement. Cold air pooled on the floor, and warmer air rose toward the ceiling. This created convective currents that could strip heat away from a sleeper's body. Inside the box bed, with the doors or curtains closed, the air was still. The sleepers were protected from these currents. The walls of the bed itself provided some insulation. Wood is not a particularly good insulator by modern standards, but it is far better than open air. The wooden walls reduced the rate at which heat could escape from the interior of the bed, helping to maintain the warmer microclimate. Some box beds were elevated above the floor, built on a platform that raised the sleeping surface by 1 or 2 feet. This was deliberate. Cold air is denser than warm air, and in a room heated by a central stove, the coldest air would settle at floor level. By raising the bed, the sleepers avoided the coldest part of the room. The opening of the box bed always faced toward the center of the cabin, toward the stove. This allowed some of the radiant heat from the stove to reach the interior of the bed when the doors or curtains were open. During the evening, as the family prepared for sleep, the bed would absorb some of this warmth. Then, when the doors were closed, that warmth was sealed inside along with the metabolic heat of the sleepers. In households with multiple children, the box bed became a shared space. 3 or 4 children would sleep together, layered side by side or with the smaller ones nestled between the older ones. Each additional body increased the total heat output, making the bed warmer for everyone. This was not just practical, it was necessary. A single child sleeping alone in a box bed would struggle to generate enough heat, but several children together created a collective warmth that kept them all safe. The box bed was also a private space in a home that otherwise had little privacy. During the day, the bed could be closed off and the platform inside could be used for storage. At night, it became a refuge, a small enclosed world where the cold and the darkness could not reach. There was a sensory quality to sleeping in a box bed. The space was dark, almost completely dark if the doors were closed, and the sounds of the room were muffled. The sleeper was cocooned, surrounded by wood, wool, and the warmth of their own body. The air inside the bed had a particular smell, a mix of wool, wood, and the faint mustiness of enclosed spaces. For children, the box bed was often the warmest and safest place they knew. It was where they retreated when the cold was too much, where they slept through the long winter nights, and where they woke in the morning to find frost on the walls of the cabin, but warmth still held inside the wooden enclosure. The box bed was not a luxury. It was a necessary adaptation to extreme cold. Without it, sleep would have been difficult, if not impossible, during the coldest months. With it, even a modest cabin could provide a space where rest was possible, where the body could recover, and where morning would come without harm. The bedding inside the box bed was as important as the structure itself. Without proper insulation between the sleeper's body and the cold air, even the enclosed space of the bed would not provide enough warmth. The material that made this insulation possible was wool. Wool has properties unlike almost any other natural fibre. It is the fleece of sheep, made up of thousands of curled, crimped fibres that trap air in the spaces between them. This trapped air is what provides insulation. But wool does something else that makes it uniquely suited to cold climates. It remains warm even when wet. Most materials lose their insulating properties when they absorb moisture. Cotton, for example, collapses when damp, and the air pockets that provide insulation disappear. The wet fabric conducts heat away from the body, making the wearer colder. This is why cotton clothing is dangerous in cold, wet environments. Wool behaves differently. The individual fibres are covered with tiny scales and contain a natural oil called lanolin. This oil makes wool water repellent. When moisture contacts wool, it does not soak into the fibre immediately. Instead, it beads on the surface or is absorbed very slowly. A wool garment or blanket can hold up to 30% of its weight in water and still feel dry to the touch. Even when wool does absorb moisture, the structure of the fibres does not collapse. The crimped shape of the fibre creates permanent air pockets that remain even when the fibre is damp. The insulation is reduced slightly, but it is not lost. A damp wool blanket is still far warmer than a damp cotton one. This property was critical in the environment of a Scandinavian winter cabin. Humans produce moisture constantly, through breathing, through perspiration, even through the moisture that evaporates from the skin. In a sealed, enclosed space like a box bed, this moisture had nowhere to go. It condensed on cold surfaces, soaked into bedding, and created dampness. If the bedding was made of materials that lost their warmth when damp, the sleepers would grow cold during the night. But wool bedding remained effective. It absorbed the moisture without losing its ability to insulate, and in the morning, when the bed was opened and the air circulated, the moisture would evaporate out of the wool naturally. The wool used in Scandinavian bedding came primarily from local sheep breeds adapted to cold climates. These sheep had thick, dual-layered fleeces with long outer fibres that shed water and a dense undercoat that provided insulation. The fleece was sheared in late spring or early summer, when the sheep no longer needed it for warmth. After shearing, the wool was washed to remove dirt and some of the excess lanolin, though not all of it. Some lanolin was left in the fibres intentionally because it improved the wool's water resistance. The clean wool was then carded, combed with metal-toothed paddles to align the fibres and remove tangles, and either spun into yarn or used directly as batting for mattresses and blankets. A typical wool mattress was a cloth case filled with loose carded wool. The case was sewn shut and placed on the sleeping platform inside the box bed. The wool inside the case provided a soft, insulating layer between the sleeper and the wooden platform. Over time, the wool would compress under the weight of the body, but it retained enough loft to remain comfortable. Wool blankets were woven from yarn on a loom. The weave was usually plain or twill, and the fabric was fulled, washed and agitated to tighten the weave and increase the density. Fulled wool was thicker, warmer, and more wind-resistant than loose-woven wool. Several blankets would be layered on top of the sleeper, creating multiple air-trapping layers. The insulating power of wool is measured in the same way as other materials, by its ability to resist heat transfer. A wool blanket approximately 1 inch thick provides an insulation value roughly equivalent to an R value of 3 to 4. By layering several blankets, the total insulation could reach an R value of 10 or more, enough to keep a body warm even in a very cold room. But the real advantage of wool was its resilience. It could be used night after night, year after year, and it would continue to perform. It did not break down quickly. It did not rot unless it stayed wet for extended periods. It was naturally resistant to many pests, though moths could damage it if it was stored improperly during the summer. Wool also had a particular texture and smell that became associated with warmth and safety. The fibres were slightly rough against the skin, not soft like cotton, but this roughness was familiar. The smell was earthy and slightly oily, the scent of lanolin mixed with the faint musk of the sheep. For people who grew up sleeping under wool blankets, these sensations were comforting. There was also a practical rhythm to the care of wool bedding. In the autumn, before the cold weather set in, the wool mattresses and blankets were aired, outside on sunny days. The sunlight and fresh air helped remove any dampness that had accumulated during storage. In the spring, after the worst of the winter was over, the bedding was washed and aired again before being stored for the warmer months. This care extended the life of the wool significantly. A well-maintained wool blanket could last for decades. It would thin over time, and the fibres would become softer and more felted, but it would still provide warmth. Some families had wool blankets that had been passed down through multiple generations, each one carrying the accumulated warmth of all the winters it had survived. Wool was not the only fibre used for insulation, but it was the best. Linen was used for sheets and summer bedding, but it was too thin and too prone to dampness for winter use. Fur and hides were used as well, and these had their own advantages, but they were less flexible and harder to clean than wool. In the end, wool was the material that made sleep possible. It was the layer between the body and the cold, the insulation that held warmth close, the fibre that adapted to moisture and continued to protect. Without it, the box bed would have been merely a wooden box. With it, the bed became a space where warmth could accumulate and rest could happen. Above the wool blankets, as the final layer of the bedding, lay the skinnfell. This was not a woven fabric. It was a coverlet made from whole sheepskins, stitched together with the fleece and hide intact. The skinnfell was the most important piece of bedding in the winter cabin. It was the outermost layer, the barrier that sealed in all the warmth generated by the body and trapped by the wool beneath. And it was the layer that had to withstand the cold air of the room while still keeping the sleeper comfortable. The construction of a skinnfell began with the selection of hides. The best skins came from mature sheep with thick, dense fleeces. The sheep were typically slaughtered in late autumn, after they had grown their winter coats but before the hardest cold set in. The hides were removed carefully to avoid damaging the fleece or the leather. Once removed, the hides were cleaned and cured. The leather side was scraped to remove any remaining flesh and fat, then treated with salt or other preservatives to prevent rot. The fleece side was washed and combed to remove dirt and tangles. The result was a hide with a thick layer of wool on one side and smooth, durable leather on the other. A single sheepskin was not large enough to cover a bed. To make a skinnfell, 4 to 7 skins were sewn together. The sewing was done using strips of leather cut from the belly of the sheep, where the hide was thinner and more flexible. These strips were strong and did not rot, making them ideal for this purpose. The skins were arranged so that the fleece side faced inward, toward the sleeper. This orientation was deliberate. The fleece provided the insulation, trapping air close to the body. The leather side faced outward, toward the cold air of the room. Leather, when treated and cured, is naturally windproof. It blocks the movement of air, preventing convective heat loss. This combination, fleece for insulation, leather for wind resistance, made the skinnfell extraordinarily effective. The fleece created a warm microclimate directly against the sleeper's body, while the leather sealed that warmth in. Cold air in the room could not penetrate the leather to reach the fleece, and the warmth generated by the body could not escape. The weight of the skinnfell also mattered. A coverlet made from 5 or 6 sheepskins was heavy, often weighing 10 to 15 pounds. This weight pressed the fleece down against the sleeper, increasing contact and improving heat transfer. It also eliminated air gaps where cold drafts could reach the body. The edges of the skinnfell were often decorated. Patterns were printed onto the leather using ink made from fermented alder bark. The designs were simple but symbolic. Suns, hearts, interlocking knots. These motifs were not purely decorative. They carried meanings related to protection, warmth, and continuity. A skinnfell was often given as a wedding gift or passed down through generations, and the designs connected it to family and tradition. The durability of a Skinnfell was remarkable. The leather, if properly cared for, could last for decades. The fleece would wear down over time, becoming thinner and more compressed, but it would still provide warmth. Some families had Skinnfell Coverlets that were 50 or 60 years old, still in use, still doing their job. Maintenance was simple, but necessary. In the spring, when the weather warmed, the Skinnfell was taken outside and aired. The fleece side was brushed to remove any dirt or debris that had accumulated during the winter. The leather side was checked for cracks or damage, and if any were found, they were repaired with patches or stitching. During the summer, the Skinnfell was stored in a dry place, often rolled up and placed in a wooden chest. Keeping it dry was essential to prevent mould and rot. Some families added herbs, lavender, wormwood, to the storage chest to repel moths and other pests. The smell of a Skinnfell was distinctive. It was the smell of lanolin from the fleece, mixed with the earthy scent of cured leather and a faint musk from the sheep itself. This smell became associated with sleep, with warmth, with the deep winter nights when the cold pressed against the walls but could not reach the bed. There was also a tactile quality to the Skinnfell that people remembered. The fleece was dense and slightly coarse, not as soft as modern wool, but substantial. The leather was smooth and cool when first touched, but warmed quickly from body heat. Sleeping under a Skinnfell felt like being enveloped, surrounded by material that was both heavy and yielding. For children, the Skinnfell was often the warmest thing they knew. On the coldest nights, when frost formed on the inside of the cabin walls and the air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, the space under the Skinnfell remained warm. The fleece held their heat close, and the leather kept the cold away. In some families, the Skinnfell was used not just for sleeping, but as a sitting cover during the day. It could be draped over a bench near the stove, providing a warm place to sit. In the evening, it was carried to the box bed and spread over the wool blankets ready for the night. The making of a Skinnfell was skilled work. Not every household could produce one. There were craftspeople who travelled from farm to farm, offering their services to sew skins together. These craftspeople were valued because they knew how to select the best hides, how to align them so the fleece was even, and how to stitch them so the seams would not come apart. A well-made Skinnfell was an investment. It represented not just the cost of the hides and the labour, but the security of knowing that the family would be warm through the winter. It was passed down as an heirloom, cared for and repaired, a tangible connection between generations. In the coldest part of the night, when the fire had burned down to coals and the room had cooled, the Skinnfell was what made sleep possible. It was the final barrier, the last layer of protection, the thing that stood between the sleeper and the frozen world outside. And it held. The complete bedding system inside the box bed was a study in layering. Each layer served a specific function, and together they created an environment where the body's own heat could be captured and held through the night. The foundation was the sleeping platform itself, a flat surface of wooden planks inside the box bed. This wood was hard and unyielding, and without something between the body and the wood, the cold would seep upward through conduction. Wood is not a particularly good insulator in direct contact with the body because it is solid, and solid materials conduct heat more effectively than materials filled with air. The first layer placed on the platform was a thick bed of straw, or dried rushes. This was not meant to be comfortable in the sense of softness. It was meant to create airspace. The straw was laid loosely, forming a mattress several inches thick. The hollow stems of the straw trapped air, and this layer of trapped air provided the first barrier against the cold coming up from below. Straw had a disadvantage. It compressed under weight. After a few nights of use, the straw would flatten and the air pockets would collapse. To maintain its effectiveness, the straw had to be fluffed and redistributed regularly, sometimes every few days. In the spring, the old straw was removed and replaced with fresh material. On top of the straw was the wool mattress. This was a large cloth sack filled with carded wool sewn shut to keep the wool in place. The wool provided both cushioning and insulation. Unlike straw, wool did not compress as much, and it retained its loft better over time. The wool mattress was the layer that made the bed comfortable enough for sleep. Above the wool mattress came the sleeper's body, and this is where the active part of the system began. The body generated heat, approximately 100 watts for an adult at rest. This heat radiated outward in all directions. Below the body it was absorbed by the wool and straw, which acted as insulation to prevent it from escaping downward. Above the body the heat rose into the layers of bedding. The first layer above the body was often a linen sheet. Linen was not an insulator, but it served a hygienic function. It created a barrier between the body and the wool blankets, which were more difficult to wash. The sheet absorbed sweat and body oils, and it could be removed and laundered more easily than the heavy wool. Above the linen sheet were the wool blankets. These were layered, typically 2 to 4 blankets, depending on the severity of the cold. Each blanket added to the total insulation, trapping more air and reducing the rate at which heat could escape. The arrangement of the blankets mattered. The first blanket, closest to the body, was usually a lighter weave, providing moderate warmth without too much weight. The second and third blankets were heavier, with a tighter weave or more thickness, adding both insulation and weight. The weight was important because it pressed the blankets down against the body, eliminating air gaps where heat could escape. Finally, on top of all the wool blankets came the Skinnfell. This was the seal. The fleece side faced down, resting on top of the wool, creating a continuous layer of fibre insulation. The leather side faced up, blocking any air movement in the room from stripping heat away. The total effect of these layers was cumulative. Each one contributed to the overall insulation value, and together they created a thermal envelope around the body. The body's heat was trapped in the space between the linen sheet and the Skinnfell, held there by the wool and fleece. The cold air in the room could not penetrate through the leather and fleece to reach the body. Inside this envelope, the temperature could be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than the air in the room. If the room was at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the space directly around the sleeper's body might be 60 or 70 degrees. This was warm enough for sleep, warm enough that the body did not have to work to generate additional heat, warm enough that rest was possible. The layering system also managed moisture. The body produces moisture constantly through perspiration and respiration. In a sealed environment like the box bed, this moisture had to go somewhere. The linen sheet absorbed some of it directly from the skin. The wool blankets absorbed more, holding it in the fibres without losing their insulating properties. And in the morning, when the bed was opened and aired, the moisture evaporated out of the layers naturally. There was a ritual to entering the bed at night. The sleeper would climb onto the platform, arrange the blankets and Skinnfell, and then slide underneath, pulling the layers up to the chin or over the head if the room was particularly cold. The weight of the bedding would settle over the body, and within a few minutes the warmth would begin to accumulate. For those sleeping together, spouses, siblings, parents and children, the heat from multiple bodies increased the effectiveness of the system. 2 people produced 200 watts of heat, and in the confined space of the box bed with all the layers in place, this was more than enough to keep both warm. Children often slept in clusters, 3 or 4 in a single bed, layered together under the wool and Skinnfell. The youngest would be placed in the middle, surrounded by older siblings, so that they received warmth from all sides. This was not just practical, it was necessary. A young child sleeping alone would struggle to generate enough heat to stay warm through the night. There was a sensory aspect to this layered sleep. The textures were varied. The rough weave of the linen, the soft density of the wool, the coarse fleece of the Skinnfell. The weight was substantial, almost like being held. The darkness inside the closed box bed was complete, and the sounds of the room were muffled. In the deepest part of the night, when the fire had burned down and the room had cooled to its lowest temperature, the layered bedding continued to hold. The heat generated hours earlier was still trapped in the wool and fleece, still radiating back toward the body. The cold pressed against the leather exterior of the Skinnfell, but it could not get through. And in the morning, when the first light appeared and the cabin began to stir, the layers would be peeled back one by one. The Skinnfell lifted, the wool blankets folded, the warmth released into the cold air, like a breath, and the sleeper would rise, having survived another night. In the harshest winters, when temperatures remained below 0 for weeks at a time, some households relied on more than wood and stone for warmth. They brought their livestock inside. The practice of housing animals and humans under the same roof was not universal, but it was common in the coldest regions of Scandinavia, and persisted in various forms from the Viking Age into the 19th century. The structure that accommodated this arrangement was called a longhouse. A longhouse was divided into sections. One end was the living quarters for the family, where the hearth or stove was located, where the box beds were built, where daily life occurred. The other end was the byre, a space for cattle, sheep, and goats. Between the two sections there was often a partition, sometimes a full wall with a door, sometimes just a low barrier that allowed air to circulate. The reason for this arrangement was simple. Animals generate heat. A mature cow at rest in a stall produces between 1200 and 1600 watts of metabolic heat. This heat is released continuously, day and night, as long as the animal is alive. It is a byproduct of digestion, respiration, and cellular metabolism. The animal's body is a furnace, burning the energy in hay and grain and releasing it as warmth. A single cow provided as much heat as a large wood-burning stove operating at moderate output. 10 cows produced 15,000 watts, enough to significantly raise the temperature inside an enclosed space. Sheep and goats produced less heat individually, around 200 watts per animal, but they were often kept in larger numbers. 20 sheep could add 4,000 watts. Combined with the cattle, the total heat output from the animals alone could rival or exceed the heat provided by the family's fire. This heat was not distributed evenly. The byre itself was the warmest part of the longhouse, heated directly by the animals' bodies, but the partition between the byre and the living quarters was not airtight. Warm air rose from the animals and drifted into the human section, especially near the ceiling. Cold air from the living quarters flowed down and into the byre, where it was warmed by the animals and rose again. This created a slow convective current that circulated warm air through the entire structure. The effect was subtle but constant. The living quarters did not become as warm as they would have with a large fire, but they remained above freezing even when the fire was banked or when fuel was scarce. The walls of a longhouse were thick, often built with double layers of logs, or with turf packed between the logs for additional insulation. The roof was heavy, weighing the structure down to seal the joints, just as in a smaller cabin. The thermal mass of the walls absorbed heat during the day, when both the fire and the animals were warming the space, and released it at night. The presence of the animals also provided a psychological benefit. They were living creatures, breathing and moving in the darkness. Their sounds, the low murmur of cows chewing cud, the soft bleating of sheep, the rustle of hooves on the straw, were familiar and reassuring. They were a reminder that life continued, even in the frozen depths of winter. But there were costs. The animals required care. They had to be fed daily, which meant someone had to leave the warmth of the living quarters and venture into the byre with hay and water. The water had to be carried in from outside, often from a well or stream that had to be broken through ice. The hay had to be stored nearby, dry and accessible. The animals also produced waste. Manure accumulated in the stalls, and if it was not managed, the smell became overwhelming. In most longhouses, fresh straw was spread over the manure regularly to absorb moisture and reduce odour. The accumulated straw and manure were removed in the spring, when the weather warmed, and used as fertiliser for the fields. The air quality in a longhouse was not ideal. The combination of animal breath, human breath, smoke from the fire, and the gases released by decomposing manure created a thick, humid atmosphere. Ventilation was limited because opening doors or windows would let in the cold. People adapted to this environment, but it was not without health consequences. Respiratory problems were common. The constant exposure to particulate matter, ammonia from the manure and high humidity contributed to chronic coughs and lung ailments. But the alternative, trying to survive the winter without the animals' heat, was worse. The relationship between the humans and the animals was one of mutual dependence. The animals provided heat, which kept the humans alive. The humans provided shelter, which kept the animals alive. In the most extreme cold, both would have perished without the shared space. There were stories of winters when the animals saved the household. When the firewood ran out or could not be brought inside due to deep snow, the heat from the livestock was all that remained. Families would move their sleeping arrangements closer to the byre, sometimes sleeping in the straw alongside the animals, wrapped in wool and sheepskins, surviving on the warmth that the animals gave. This was not romanticised, it was not pleasant, but it worked. The animals were not pets, they were working partners in survival. In the spring, when the weather warmed and the snow melted, the byre would be cleaned out, the animals would be moved to pasture, and the longhouse would be opened to air. The smell would dissipate, the walls would dry. But when winter returned, the animals came back inside. The partition was closed, the slow circulation of warm air began again, and the biological furnace, steady, patient, reliable, kept the household from freezing through the long dark months. The integration of livestock into the winter household was not merely practical. It created a relationship that shaped daily routines, family roles, and the rhythm of life during the coldest months. Morning began with the animals. Before the fire was rebuilt, before breakfast was prepared, someone had to tend the livestock. This task usually fell to the children or the younger adults, those who could move quickly in the cold and had the energy to carry water and hay. The byre was entered through a low door or opening in the partition. The air inside was thick and warm, heavy with the smell of animals and straw. Breath condensed into visible clouds. The cattle would stir as the person entered, shifting their weight, turning their heads. They were fed first, armfuls of hay pulled from the stored supply and placed in the mangers. Water was the more difficult task. In the depths of winter, the nearest water source was often frozen. Wells had to be cleared of ice, streams had to be broken open. The water, once obtained, had to be carried back to the longhouse in wooden buckets, and it had to be given to the animals before it froze again. The cattle drank slowly, their breath warming the water as they lowered their muzzles into the bucket. Sheep and goats were more skittish, jostling for position, spilling water onto the straw. The person tending them had to move carefully, avoiding hooves and horns in the dim light. Once the animals were fed and watered, the stalls were checked. Fresh straw was added if needed. Any animal showing signs of illness, lethargy, laboured breathing, refusal to eat, was noted and watched. In the isolation of winter, a sick animal could not be easily treated. If it died, it was a significant loss, not just economically, but thermally. One fewer cow meant less heat in the longhouse. The midday hours were quieter. The animals rested, chewing their cud or sleeping in their stalls. The heat they generated continued to rise into the living quarters, mixing with the warmth from the fire. In the afternoon, if the weather was clear, someone might open the door briefly to let in fresh air, but this was done quickly. The cold entered in a rush, and the door was closed again before the warmth could escape. Evening brought another round of feeding. The animals had to be given enough hay to last through the night, because no one would return to the byre until morning. Water was offered again, though many animals drank less in the evening. The straw was checked one last time, and the partition door was closed. Through the night the animals continued their work. They stood or lay in their stalls, their bodies processing the hay, their breath adding moisture to the air, their heat radiating outward. They did not sleep in the way humans sleep. They dozed, half aware, ready to rise if startled. In the living quarters, the family could hear the animals, the sound of chewing, the occasional low call of a cow, the shuffle of hooves. These sounds were part of the night time. Soundscape as familiar as the crackle of the banked fire or the creak of the log walls contracting in the cold. There was a hierarchy among the animals in terms of their contribution to warmth. Cattle were the most valuable. A single cow produced more heat than 10 sheep. Horses, if they were kept inside, produced even more, but they were less common in winter housing because they required more space and more feed. Sheep and goats were useful in numbers, and they had the added benefit of producing wool and milk, but their individual heat output was small. The animals also had different temperaments. Cattle were generally calm, accepting of the confinement. Sheep were nervous, prone to sudden movements if startled. Goats were curious and mischievous, sometimes escaping their stalls and wandering into the living quarters, where they would chew on anything within reach. Children who grew up in longhouses developed an early familiarity with livestock. They learned to move around the animals without fear, to read their behaviour, to know when a cow was content and when it was agitated. This knowledge was practical, but it also created a bond. The animals were not strangers. They were part of the household, contributors to survival. In some families, the animals were given names. A particularly productive cow, one that had lived through many winters, might be referred to with affection. When such an animal died, it was a loss felt by the entire household, not just because of the economic impact, but because of the absence of a presence that had been constant and reliable. The partnership between humans and animals in the longhouse was not equal. The animals had no choice in the arrangement. They were confined, fed what was given, and their bodies were used for warmth just as their milk and wool were used for sustenance and clothing. But within that framework, there was a mutual dependence that could not be denied. The humans needed the animals to survive the winter. The animals needed the humans to provide food and shelter. Neither could endure the cold alone. Together, in the shared space of the longhouse, they created a system that worked. In the spring, when the weather warmed and the snow began to melt, the partition would be opened. The animals would be led outside, blinking in the bright sunlight, their legs stiff from months of confinement. The byre would be cleaned, the straw and manure hauled away. The smell would fade, but the memory of those winter months remained. The warmth of the animals, the sounds in the darkness, the knowledge that survival had depended on more than human effort alone. The animals had been partners, silent and steady, providing the heat that kept the longhouse alive through the coldest nights. In a cabin sealed against the cold, where every gap was chinked with moss and every door was closed tight, the air inside became something different from the air outside. It grew thick with moisture, heavy with the breath of sleepers, dense with the invisible exhalations of bodies at rest. This moisture came from many sources. Each person exhaled water vapour with every breath, roughly a litre of moisture per day through respiration alone. Cooking added more, as boiling water released steam into the room. If livestock shared the space, their breathing and the evaporation from their bodies contributed significantly. Even the wood in the walls, responding to the warmth of the fire, released stored moisture as it dried. In the enclosed environment of the winter cabin, this moisture had nowhere to go. It accumulated in the air, raising the relative humidity to uncomfortable levels. When the warm, moist air came into contact with the cold log walls near the perimeter of the room, it condensed into liquid water, or, if the walls were cold enough, into frost. This condensation was a problem. Water on the wooden walls could lead to rot. Frost in the chinking could damage the moss. Damp bedding lost its insulating properties. Prolonged exposure to high humidity created conditions for mould growth, which affected both the structure and the health of the inhabitants. The solution, counterintuitive as it seemed, was to open the cabin to the outside air. This practice was known as sjokklufting, or shock airing. Once or twice each day, usually in the morning and again in the evening, the doors and windows of the cabin were opened wide. The cold air rushed in. The warm, moist interior air rushed out. For 5 to 10 minutes the cabin was fully exposed to the frozen world outside. The reason this worked had to do with the nature of cold air. Air at 30 degrees below zero holds almost no moisture. The colder the air, the less water vapour it can contain. At extreme cold, the saturation point is so low that the air is essentially dry. When this cold, dry air entered the cabin, it was initially very cold. But as it mixed with the warmer air inside and was heated by the residual warmth from the stove and walls, its capacity to hold moisture increased dramatically. The air became thirsty for water. This newly warmed air absorbed moisture from every surface it touched. It pulled water vapour from the damp bedding, from the condensation on the walls, from the breath still lingering in the room. Within minutes, the relative humidity inside the cabin dropped from near saturation to a much lower, more manageable level. The temperature also dropped, but not as much as might be expected. The thermal mass of the log walls and the masonry stove meant that the majority of the heat was stored in solid materials, not in the air. The air itself was only a small fraction of the total heat in the room. Replacing the air did not significantly reduce the overall warmth of the cabin. Once the shock airing was complete, the doors and windows were closed again. The stove, which had been banked or maintained at a low level during the airing, was stoked back up. The room warmed quickly and the newly introduced dry air made the warmth feel more comfortable. The timing of the shock airing was important. It was done during the day when the fire could be used to quickly restore warmth. It was never done in the middle of the night when the fire was at its lowest and the inhabitants were asleep. The morning airing happened after everyone had risen, before the day's activities began. The evening airing happened before the fire was banked for the night. The duration was also critical. 5 to 10 minutes was usually sufficient. Any longer, and the cabin would lose too much heat. Any shorter, and the moisture would not be adequately removed. Experience taught each household the right length of time for their specific cabin and weather conditions. There was a sensory shock to the practice. When the door was opened, the cold entered like a living thing. The air was sharp, biting, immediate. Faces stung. Breath became visible. The warmth of the room seemed to flee in an instant, pouring out through the open door and dissipating into the frozen world. But after a few minutes, as the air exchange completed, there was a noticeable difference. The air felt cleaner. The heaviness was gone. The mustiness that had accumulated overnight was replaced by a crispness that made breathing easier. Children were often sent outside during the shock airing, both to get them out of the way and to give them a brief exposure to fresh air. They would stand in the snow, wrapped in their wool cloaks, watching the plume of warm, moist air rise from the cabin's door like smoke. When they were called back inside, the cabin felt different. Colder at first, but cleaner, less oppressive. The practice of shock airing required discipline. On the coldest days, when the temperature outside was at its most extreme, there was a strong temptation to skip it, to keep the cabin sealed and preserve every bit of warmth. But families who gave in to this temptation paid the price. The moisture would build, the walls would dampen, and the bedding would lose its effectiveness. Those who maintained the practice, even on the worst days, found that their cabins remained drier and healthier. The wood did not rot. The bedding stayed warm. The air inside was breathable, even after a long night in a sealed box bed. The paradox of ventilation was this. To stay warm through the winter, you had to let the cold in. Not constantly, not for long, but regularly and deliberately. The cold air was not the enemy. It was a tool, a means of removing the moisture that would otherwise undermine every other effort to maintain warmth. This understanding was passed down through generations, encoded in the daily routine. Open the door in the morning, let the cold in, feel the shock, wait, close the door, build up the fire, move forward into the day. It was a small ritual, brief and uncomfortable, but it was as essential to survival as the fire itself. The winter cabin was not silent. It spoke constantly, in a language that those who lived within it learned to understand. The sounds were subtle, easily missed by someone unfamiliar with the structure, but to the inhabitants, they conveyed important information about the state of the building and the world outside. The most dramatic sound was the frost crack. This occurred when the temperature dropped rapidly and the moisture inside a log froze. Water expands when it freezes, and if enough moisture was present in the wood fibres, the expansion created pressure. When the pressure exceeded the strength of the wood, the log would split. The sound was sharp and loud like a pistol shot. It came without warning, sudden and violent. In the deep night when everyone was asleep, a frost crack could wake the entire household. The sound echoed through the cabin, and for a moment there would be confusion. What had made that noise? Was something wrong? But those familiar with the cabin knew immediately what it was. The cold had claimed another log. In the morning someone would inspect the walls looking for the new split. It would appear as a thin line running along the grain of a log, sometimes just a hairline fracture, sometimes a gap wide enough to see through. These cracks were not necessarily a problem. If the split was small and did not penetrate all the way through the log, it did not compromise the structure. The crack might even close up again when the weather warmed and the wood expanded. But if the crack was large, it needed attention. Moss would be packed into it, or the crack would be sealed with clay or resin to prevent air from passing through. The frequency of frost cracks increased as the temperature dropped. On a night when the temperature fell to 40 below, the cabin might crack 3 or 4 times. Each crack was a reminder of the pressure the cold was exerting, the force trying to break through the walls. There were other sounds from the logs themselves. As the cabin cooled at night, the wood contracted. This contraction was slow and usually silent, but sometimes it was accompanied by a low groan, a creaking sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls. This was the entire structure settling, adjusting to the temperature change. The turf roof also made sounds. When snow accumulated on top, the weight pressed down, and the wooden beams supporting the roof would creak under the load. This creaking was normal and expected. It was the sound of the roof doing its job, compressing the logs and sealing the joints. But if the creaking became too frequent or too loud, it could indicate that the snow load was becoming excessive, and someone would need to go outside and clear some of it away. Wind was another voice in the cabin soundscape. The walls, despite their thickness and the precision of the chinking, were not perfectly airtight. When the wind blew hard, it found the tiny gaps, places where a log had warped slightly, where the moss had compressed more than expected, where a corner joint had a microscopic opening. The wind did not whistle through these gaps. Instead, it created a low hum, a vibration that could be felt as much as heard. This hum changed depending on the wind speed and direction. A steady wind from the north created a different sound than a gusting wind from the west. People learned to interpret these sounds, to know when the wind was rising and when it was falling. The sound of the wind outside was also important. When the wind blew across the snow, it created a hissing sound, a constant background noise that indicated drifting. If the hiss was high-pitched and sharp, the snow was dry and light, being carried in clouds across the surface. If the sound was deeper and more muffled, the snow was heavier, and the wind was having a harder time moving it. A deep moan in the wind was a warning. It meant a storm was building, that the wind was increasing in strength, and the temperature was likely dropping further. When that moan was heard, people checked the livestock, brought in extra firewood, and made sure the cabin was sealed as tightly as possible. Inside the cabin, the fire had its own sounds. The crackle of burning wood was familiar and comforting, but the specific quality of the crackling conveyed information. Dry wood crackled sharply. Damp wood hissed and popped. Resinous pine made a snapping sound as pockets of resin ignited. By listening to the fire, someone could judge the quality of the wood being burned and adjust the next load accordingly. The masonry stove, as it heated and cooled, created sounds of its own. The stone or brick would expand when hot and contract when cold, and this movement caused faint ticking or clicking sounds. These were most noticeable in the hours after the fire had burned down, when the stove was cooling. The ticking was rhythmic, almost like a clock, marking the slow release of stored heat. The animals, if they were present in an attached byre, contributed to the soundscape. The low murmur of cows, the occasional bleat of sheep, the rustle of straw. These were constant reminders that the household was not alone in its struggle against the cold. The sounds were reassuring. Silence from the byre was concerning. It might mean an animal was sick or distressed. Human sounds were part of the environment as well. Breathing, especially in the enclosed space of a box bed, was audible. Snoring, coughing, the rustle of shifting under the wool and skin fell, all of these sounds filled the night. In the darkness, when vision was limited, sound became the primary sense for monitoring the well-being of family members. There was also the sound of ice. On the coldest nights, frost would form on the inside of the door and around the edges of windows. As the temperature fluctuated slightly, this frost would shift, creating tiny cracking sounds. It was a delicate sound, barely noticeable, but those who were awake in the deep night could hear it, the sound of ice growing, spreading across wood and metal. Learning to read these sounds was part of growing up in a winter cabin. Children learned to distinguish between a harmless frost crack and a structural problem. They learned to hear the wind's warnings. They learned to gauge the fire's condition by the quality of its crackling. This knowledge was not taught formally. It was absorbed through experience, through hundreds of nights listening in the darkness. The sounds of the cold were not just information. They were also companionship. In the long hours of the Arctic night, when the world outside was frozen and silent, the cabin's sounds were a reminder that the structure was alive in its own way, working to hold back the cold. The groaning logs, the ticking stove, the hiss of the wind, these were the voices of survival. Heat in the winter cabin did not distribute evenly. It created zones, invisible boundaries where the temperature shifted, where warmth accumulated or dissipated. Understanding these zones was essential for arranging the space and for knowing where to place yourself during different parts of the day. The warmest zone was immediately adjacent to the stove. If the stove was made of masonry and fired correctly, the surface temperature of the stone could reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Within a few feet of this surface, the air temperature could be 70 or 80 degrees, comfortable by any standard. This zone was highly localized. The heat radiated outward from the stove in straight lines like light from a lamp. Objects directly in front of the stove absorbed this radiant heat and became warm themselves. A person sitting within 3 feet of the stove would feel the warmth on the side of their body facing the stove, while the other side remained cooler. This created a gradient. At 3 feet from the stove, the temperature might be 70 degrees. At 6 feet, it might be 60. At 10 feet, 50. The exact numbers varied depending on the size of the stove, the amount of heat it had absorbed, and the insulation of the cabin, but the pattern was consistent. The farther from the stove, the colder the air. Above the stove, warm air rose. This created a column of rising air that carried heat toward the ceiling. The ceiling was the warmest part of the cabin's airspace, sometimes 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the air near the floor. This stratification was natural, a result of hot air being less dense than cold air. The ceiling's warmth was not directly useful to the inhabitants, but it served a function. The warm air at the ceiling warmed the underside of the roof, which reduced the rate at which heat was lost through the roof structure. It also created a thermal buffer, a layer of insulation made of air itself. Near the floor, the temperature was significantly lower. Cold air, being denser, sank to the lowest point in the room. On the coldest nights, the floor could be near freezing even when the air at chest height was 50 degrees. This is why box beds were elevated. Sleeping on the floor would mean sleeping in the coldest zone of the cabin. The perimeter walls created another distinct zone. The log walls, despite their thickness, were in direct contact with the frozen exterior. The inner surface of the logs was colder than the air in the centre of the room, sometimes by 10 or 20 degrees. This cold surface radiated a chill inward, creating a band of cooler air around the edges of the cabin. People instinctively avoided these perimeter zones when possible. Sitting near the outer wall meant feeling the radiant cold pulling heat away from your body. Tasks that required standing still, mending clothing, preparing food, were done near the stove or in the centre of the room away from the walls. There were also microclimates created by furniture and partitions. A wooden table in the centre of the room acted as a barrier, blocking the radiant heat from the stove on one side and creating a slightly cooler zone on the other. A partition between the living area and the byre created a boundary where warm air from the animals met cooler air from the human space. The box bed, when occupied, became its own thermal zone. The enclosed space, heated by the sleepers' bodies and insulated by the layers of wool and sheepskin, could be 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the room outside. Opening the door of the box bed released this accumulated warmth in a rush, a wave of warm, slightly humid air that mixed with the cooler air of the room. Understanding these zones influenced behaviour. In the morning, when the fire was being rebuilt, people stayed near the stove, waiting for it to warm before venturing to other parts of the cabin. During the coldest part of the afternoon, when the fire might be allowed to burn lower to conserve wood, people gathered in the warmest zone, sharing the heat. Children learned these zones early. They knew where they could play, without getting too cold. They knew that standing near the outer wall was uncomfortable, but that sitting near the stove was pleasant. They learned to position themselves based on the task they were doing and the temperature they needed. The distribution of warmth also affected decisions about where to place objects. Clothing that needed to dry was hung near the stove, but not too close. Too much heat could damage the fibres. Bread dough that needed to rise was placed in a warm spot, but not in direct radiant heat. Water buckets were kept away from the coldest zones to prevent freezing. At night, when the fire was banked and the stove began to cool, the zones shifted. The area immediately around the stove remained the warmest for the longest time, but the gradient flattened. The centre of the room cooled toward the temperature of the perimeter. The only truly warm zones were inside the box beds, where the sleeper's body heat maintained a habitable microclimate. In the hours before, dawn, when the cabin reached its coldest point, the invisible rooms of warmth contracted. The stove's radiant heat had diminished to a gentle glow. The air near the ceiling had cooled. The floor was close to freezing. The only warmth left was in the thermal mass of the logs and stone, releasing stored energy slowly, and in the box beds, where layers of wool and fleece held the heat close to the sleepers' bodies. This was the moment when the cabin's design was tested. If the logs were chinked properly, if the roof was sealed, if the stove had stored enough heat, the temperature inside would remain above the point where survival was threatened. The zones of warmth would be small and localized, but they would still exist. And when morning came, and the coals were uncovered and fed with fresh wood, the zones would expand again. The invisible rooms would grow, pushing back the cold, reclaiming the space inside the cabin. The warmth would return not all at once, but gradually spreading, from the stove outward, layer by layer, until the cabin was habitable once more. The coldest moment of the night came just before dawn. The fire had been banked hours earlier, and the heat stored in the masonry stove and log walls had slowly dissipated. The cabin's temperature had dropped to its lowest point, hovering somewhere between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the severity of the outside cold and the quality of the cabin's construction. Inside the box beds, the sleepers remained warm, cocooned in layers of wool and sheepskin, but the air in the main room was sharp and still. Frost had formed on the inside of the door and around the edges of any cracks in the walls. The darkness was complete, broken only by the faint red glow from the banked coals if someone had left a small gap in the ash covering. The first person to wake was usually the one responsible for the fire. This might be the head of the household, or it might be an older child who had been given the task. Waking at this hour required discipline. The box bed was warm, and the air outside it was cold. Leaving the bed meant immediate discomfort, but it had to be done. The fire had to be revived before the household could function. The person rose slowly, pushing back the skinfell and the wool blankets. The cold air hit immediately, sharp against the face and hands. Breath became visible. Fingers, still warm from sleep, began to stiffen as they touched the cold wood of the bed frame. Clothing was put on quickly. Wool leggings, a heavy tunic, thick socks. These had been kept inside the box bed overnight to stay warm and dry. Clothing left in the main room would be cold to the touch, almost frozen in the most extreme temperatures. Once dressed, the person climbed out of the box bed and moved toward the stove or hearth. The floor was cold, even through the socks. Each step was deliberate, avoiding the coldest zones near the outer walls. At the stove, the first task was to uncover the coals. The layer of ash that had been carefully placed the night before was now gently raked aside. This had to be done with care. Too much disturbance could smother the coals. Too little, and they would remain buried. As the ash was moved, the glow beneath became visible. Red and orange, faint but unmistakable. The coals were still alive. This was the critical moment. The confirmation that the banking had worked, that the fire had survived the night. If the coals were strong, glowing brightly when exposed, the task would be easy. If they were weak, barely glowing, more care would be needed. But even weak coals could be revived if handled properly. The next step was to add kindling. Thin strips of dry wood, usually birch bark which ignited easily, or shavings of pine, were placed directly on the exposed coals. The person would often lean close, blowing gently on the coals to introduce oxygen. The breath had to be controlled, steady. Too much air, and the ash would scatter. Too little, and the coals would not ignite the kindling. As oxygen reached the coals, they brightened. The glow intensified. Heat radiated upward. The kindling began to smoke, then to char, and finally to catch fire. A small flame appeared, tentative at first, then growing stronger as it consumed the thin wood. More kindling was added, building the fire gradually. Larger pieces came next, sticks the thickness of a finger, then split logs the size of a wrist. Each addition had to be timed correctly. Add wood too soon, and the small flame would be smothered. Wait too long, and the flame would die out. But if done correctly, the fire would build. The flames would grow, crackling and bright, filling the hearth or the firebox of the stove. The immediate area around the fire would begin to warm. The person tending the fire could feel the heat on their face and hands, a sharp contrast to the cold air at their back. As the fire established itself, the cabin began to transform. The darkness retreated slightly as the flames provided light. The sharp, frozen quality of the air softened. The frost on the door began to glisten as the temperature rose enough to start melting it. Other members of the household would begin to stir, drawn by the sound of the fire and the promise of warmth. They would emerge from the box beds one by one, dressed quickly, and move toward the stove. The coldest part of the day was ending. The morning routine continued with practical tasks. If there were animals in an attached byre, they needed to be fed and watered. If not, the first meal of the day had to be prepared. Water that had been brought in the night before might have a skim of this ice on its surface. It would be placed near the stove to thaw and warm. Bread or porridge was made using grains stored in the cabin. The cooking process added more warmth to the room, both from the fire and from the steam released by boiling water. The air, which had been dry and sharp, began to gain moisture again. The morning shock airing would happen soon, within an hour of waking. The doors would be open, the cold air would rush in, and the accumulated moisture from the night would be expelled. But before that happened, the fire had to be strong enough to quickly rewarm the cabin afterward. The revival of the fire was more than a practical task. It was a confirmation that the night had been survived. The ember had been preserved, the continuity maintained. The fire that had been banked the evening before was the same fire that now burned in the morning. It had not died, it had only rested. This continuity mattered. In many households, the fire was considered sacred in a secular sense, not religious, but essential. It was the heart of the home, the source of warmth and light, and the means of preparing food. Letting it die completely was seen as a failure of stewardship. There were stories of winters when the fire did go out, when the coals were not banked properly, or the wood was too damp, or the cold was too extreme. When that happened, someone had to go to a neighbour's house, sometimes a long walk through deep snow, and bring back coals in a metal bucket. This was a humbling task, an admission that the household had failed in its most basic duty. But on this morning, the fire had not failed. The coals had been preserved. The ember had returned, and as the flames grew and the cabin warmed, the household moved forward into another day, carried by the warmth that had never truly left. The log cabin, after decades of use, became more than a structure. It became a record, a physical archive of the winters it had endured and the lives it had sheltered. The logs themselves bore the marks of time. The outer surfaces exposed to the weather had darkened and weathered. The inner surfaces, protected from sun and rain, remained lighter but had absorbed decades of smoke from the hearth. This smoke created a patina, a dark coating that preserved the wood and gave the interior a distinctive colour and smell. The moss in the chinking had compressed over the years, becoming almost like felt. In some places it had been replaced multiple times as sections deteriorated or were disturbed. Each replacement was slightly different, depending on when it was done and who did the work. The cabin's walls were therefore a layered history, with moss from different years coexisting in different joints. The corner notches, where the logs interlocked, showed the effects of settling. The joints had compressed tightly over time, pressed together by the weight of the roof and the natural shrinkage of the wood. In a well-built cabin, these joints became so tight that no light could pass through them, no air could move between them. The precision of the original scribing remained visible in the perfect fit of the logs. The stove, if it was made of masonry, bore its own marks. The firebrick inside the firebox showed cracks and discoloration from years of intense heat. The exterior surface, if it had been tiled, might show chips or repairs where tiles had been replaced. The mortar between the stones or bricks had aged, darkening and hardening over time. The floor showed patterns of wear. Near the stove, where people stood most often, the wood was smooth and slightly hollowed from countless footsteps. Near the door, where snow and ice had been tracked in and out, the wood might be more weathered, showing the effects of moisture. The paths people walked most frequently were visible in the wear pattern of the floor. The box beds retained impressions of use. The sleeping platforms, compressed by the weight of sleepers over many years, had slight depressions where bodies had rested. The wool mattresses inside, even when fluffed, showed the accumulated compression of decades of use. The wooden doors or frames bore the marks of hands opening and closing them thousands of times. The roof, from the inside, showed the effects of smoke and heat. The underside of the birch bark and the wooden beams were darkened, almost black in some places. This darkening was preservation. The smoke had dried the wood and killed any organisms that might have caused rot. A roof that had been properly smoked could last for generations. Outside, the turf on the roof had become a distinct ecosystem. The grass that grew there was different from the grass in the surrounding fields. It was fertilised by decomposition within the turf and shaped by the unique conditions of growing on a roof. In summer, flowers might bloom there. In winter, the snow covered it completely. But beneath the snow, the roots remained alive, holding the structure together. The cabin also remembered through the objects within it. Tools hung on the walls, axes, saws, scrapers, showed wear patterns that spoke to how they had been used. The handles were smooth where hands had gripped them, slightly hollowed by decades of friction. The metal blades showed the marks of sharpening, the accumulation of fine scratches that indicated careful maintenance. Textiles in the cabin bore their own history. A wool blanket that had been used for 30 years was thinner than when it was new, softer, more compressed. The fibres had felted slightly from use and washing, but it still provided warmth. A Skinnfell that had been passed down through generations showed repairs, patches where the leather had torn, additional stitching where seams had weakened. These repairs were part of the object's story. The cabin remembered the people who had lived in it through small modifications and additions. A shelf, added to hold more storage, a hook driven into a beam for hanging clothing, a small carving in a log, initials, a date, a simple mark, left by someone who wanted to note their presence. These modifications accumulated over time, each one a small adjustment that made the cabin more suited to its inhabitants. The knowledge embedded in the cabin was also a form of memory. The way the logs had been selected and shaped, the precision of the chinking, the design of the stove, all of this represented understanding that had been refined over generations. The cabin was not just built according to tradition, it was tradition made physical. Each winter the cabin survived added to this embedded knowledge. If a particular joint had held well, that validated the technique used to create it. If a section of chinking had failed, that taught a lesson about materials or method. The cabin was a continuous experiment, tested every year by the cold, and the results of that testing informed how future cabins would be built. The sensory memory of the cabin was also significant. The smell of smoke and wood and wool and lanolin. This combination was unique to each cabin, a signature created by the specific materials used and the specific lives lived within. Someone who had grown up in a particular cabin would recognize that smell anywhere, even decades later. The sound of the cabin was also distinctive. The particular creak of a certain floorboard, the specific tone of the frost cracks in the walls, the way the wind sounded against the door. These sounds were as familiar to the inhabitants as the voices of family members. When a cabin was finally abandoned, when the family moved elsewhere, or when the structure became too old to maintain, it did not disappear immediately. The logs, if they were still sound, might be taken apart and used to build another structure. The moss chinking would dry and crumble, the turf roof would collapse inward, and grass would grow over the remains. But before that happened, the cabin stood as a testament. It had kept people alive through winters that could easily have killed them. It had been a barrier between the frozen world and the warm space where sleep was possible. It had held the fire, sheltered the sleepers, and withstood the pressure of cold measured in tons of frozen air pressing against every surface. The cabin remembered all of this, encoded in the wood and stone and moss, in the wear patterns and the smoke stains and the compressed joints. It was a structure, yes, but it was also a teacher. It taught that survival in extreme cold was possible, not through brute force, but through understanding. Understanding of materials, of heat, of moisture, of the slow rhythm of fire through the long night. What the cabin remembered, ultimately, was that human beings could live in one of the harshest environments on Earth, not by conquering the cold, but by building carefully, tending patiently, and trusting in the wisdom accumulated over thousands of winters. The log walls, the moss-filled joints, the stone stove, the wool bedding, each element was a piece of that wisdom, proven reliable by the simple fact that morning always came and the people inside were still there to see it.